Okay, good morning. So we are going to today be looking at something called the water cycle. Now the reason why we're looking at this is we're going to, in the next lessons, we're going to be thinking about the environment, climate change, global warming, words which you might have heard of, but we will explain them in the next few lessons. But to start with, we're going to look at water cycle because we know water is so very important for us to drink, for plants to grow, for animals to drink as well. So it is a really important aspect that we need to have in planet Earth for us to be able to survive. So we're going to have a look at the water cycle first, which I know we briefly talked about in year 3. So obviously we're going to just recap that today so that we're ready to look at the next part next week. So we're going to start by looking at the particles. Now, when I talk about a solid, a liquid and a gas, I want you to just think of a few examples of what a solid is, what a liquid is and what a gas is. So if you could write some of these, pause the video now, and if you could write me some examples down. So it might be that you write the subheading solid and write me 5 examples of a solid underneath. Write the subheading liquid, write me 5 examples of different liquids, and write me gas as a subheading, and then write me down some different examples of a gas as well. Now gas you might find a little bit harder to get 5 examples, but if you can come up with 5, that will be amazing. Okay, and then once you've done that, press play and we'll see if you've got some of the same. Okay, solid, you could have come up with anything: tables, chairs, trampolines, beds. It could have been pots and pans, things like that, they're all really solid. And the reason why they're solid is if you look at the particles for solid, the particles which make up a solid are so compact tightly that that's what makes them hard and solid, because the particles cannot move at all. Liquids, you could have come up with things like water, lemonade, Coca-Cola, juice, milk, anything really that is a liquid, which we know is a liquid because if you look at the particles on a liquid, there are lots of particles in a liquid, but because they're not fully compact and tight, they can move around a little bit. So that means that obviously the liquid can move, when you're pouring it, it can move because the particles can also move as well. Finally, gases, you could have come up with things like oxygen, which we breathe, carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, methane, which maybe when a cow goes to the toilet. You could have also had carbon monoxide. You could have had, there's lots of different ones that you could have had. And the reason why these are gases is because if we look at the particles, it's the type of, a gas is something you cannot necessarily see, but because the particles are so spread out, the gas can move wherever it wants to go, whether it's in a room or outside or wherever. So we're going to look at the water cycle. Now there's more than 3/4 of the Earth surface is made out of water, and what happens to this water is sometimes it's evaporated, sometimes it's condensed, and there's other ways as well, which we're going to talk about next. So here's just a few. So some of the water evaporates from the heat, because we know when water heats up, it boils to a point where it turns from a liquid to a gas and it evaporates. And then once it's evaporated, it's almost like in a form of water vapour. So the clouds suck up the water vapour and it sits inside the clouds. It is then condensed into really tiny water droplets, which obviously when it what we call precipitates, it starts to rain. The water droplets get too big, they start to fall from the clouds, which is where the water comes from the clouds. These can either fall as rain or hail or snow, depending on the temperature, because remember, when it hits 0 degrees, the water droplets can also turn, obviously we know the freezing point for water is 0 degrees, so we know that water can obviously turn to snow at that point. 300 million litres of water fall on the land each day, and so obviously as it falls down, it runs into the streams and reservoirs and other sources of where there's water, lakes, and then obviously the cycle starts again. So we're going to have a look at the cycle, and just to break it down so you can visualise how the water cycle works. So this is my picture here. And we can see that the water from the lakes and from the rivers at first moves up towards the clouds. So it evaporates from from the lakes and moves up into the clouds. From that point, the clouds are condensed, condensation happens, okay, and then that condensation leads to precipitation where the rain falls from the clouds onto the ground below. Then as the groundwater, it runs down mountains, down hills, down streams and rivers, or even underground as well, until it gets back to the sea or back to rivers or lakes, and then the water cycle starts again and the sun heats the water up to lead to this evaporation. So here we can briefly see, so the heat from the sun causes the water to evaporate, which is why as well when it's sunny there's no puddles, because the water from the puddles evaporates as well. And then this evaporation takes that water up and the liquid becomes into water vapour, which then obviously goes into the clouds. Okay, so what happens next? So condensation happens, so the water vapour in the air rises, and as it does it cools down. So obviously it's heated up to a point where it's evaporated, it then moves up to the clouds and then it starts to cool down. Eventually it's cool enough for the water vapour to start to condense. You might see, for example, on the windows, if it's been really cold, you'll see condensation on the windows. The windows will look wet, especially if it's, say, hotter inside and colder outside because the water's cooling down. And then the droplets of water clump together to form a cloud. So the water evaporates up, cools down and condenses to make a cloud. Then the wind pushes the condensation, the clouds, around to different areas. And then what happens, we then have the clouds turn into rain clouds where precipitation occurs. So as more water is condensed and forms those droplets inside the clouds, eventually the droplets are too heavy and too large that they end up falling back down to earth as rain or as sleet or as snow. When water falls down to the earth, this obviously runs down hills, down mountains, makes puddles, it runs into streams or lakes or rivers, and then it can also go into the soil as well, which obviously helps the nutrients in the soil to help the plants and rivers grow. And then what happens then is as the water runs down the mountains and down the streams, it obviously runs back into things like oceans and lakes and seas, and then the cycle starts again. So I would like you, looking at the 4 words underneath, okay, they are all jumbled up, and I want you to see if you can try and figure out what these words are, thinking about the 4 main stages we've talked about, to see if you can identify what these words are. So I'd like you to pause the video now, and as soon as you have figured out what these words mean, press play and we'll see if you've got them correct. Okay, the first one should have been condensation. The second one, collection. The third one, precipitation. And the fourth one, evaporation. Now, thinking of the water cycle, I want you to think about what order these would go in. So if we start from the water being in the lake, what happens first, then what happens, then what's next, and then what's final. So I'd like you please to see if you can write the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 on the 4 words and see if you can get them in the correct order. Okay, let's have a look. So evaporation should have been first, because as the water is heated, it evaporates and goes up into the clouds. Then condensation happens for the water vapour to turn and form clouds, before precipitation happens when the raindrops drop from the clouds because the raindrops are too heavy. And then finally the collection of the water as it hits the ground and it runs back down into oceans. It's collected together before the cycle starts again. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is I would like you to draw a picture of the water cycle. So you could copy this or you could make your own picture up as well. Then what I would like you to do is I want you to explain it. So I would like you it depends how big your picture is. You might have space on your picture. However, if you haven't got space on your picture, I would like you to write a good chunky paragraph to explain how the water gets from the seas or from the lakes all the way up to the clouds, to come back out of the clouds onto the ground and then return back to the lakes, using the keywords evaporation, condensation, precipitation and collection. Obviously collection is not on here, however we know that that is when the water is on the ground and it collects back into the lakes and the rivers. So I'd like you to go and have a go at doing this now. Make sure it's beautifully coloured and presented really beautifully. You could also present it by reading out and explaining what the water cycle is, as if you were a news reporter, to explain what this cycle is and how it works. Okay, and then I'd like you to put your work onto Seesaw so that I can have a look at it, and then I can give you some feedback on that as well.